Hello and welcome to It's Not So Lonely at the Top podcast. This is a podcast for business leaders and business owners just like you. We're going to be sharing top tips on how to develop yourself personally and professionally. I'm going to be sharing updated podcasts on a regular basis, so please do make sure you subscribe, and I really hope you enjoy today's podcast. Hello, and I'm joined today by Captain Emma Henderson MBE. She's a former airline captain with over 30 years experience, and actually she's one of less than 500 women worldwide to have held that role, which is absolutely incredible. And in 2020, she founded Project Wingman, which mobilised 6,500 aircrew volunteers to support NHS staff with wellbeing, for which she was then awarded an MBE. Today, she's an international keynote speaker and founder of Grounded Leadership. She's also recently recorded a TEDx. I'm really pleased that Emma's taken the time out to speak to me today, and I hope you enjoy the insights as much as I did. Emma, well, let's get going, shall we?
Yeah, let's
get going. So you were one of less than 500 women worldwide to become an airline captain. Looking back, what drive or belief has carried you through the challenges of building your career in such a male-dominated world?
Well, I think it's really the belief that there was no barrier in, I didn't believe that I couldn't do it. I just assumed that I could. If I decided I wanted to do something, I've always assumed that there's a way to do it, which I guess must come from my parents and my upbringing. Although when I sort of said to them I wanted to be a pilot, they didn't sort of jump around and say, oh yeah, you must do that. Let's facilitate that for you. But it just never occurred to me that I couldn't do it. And I think that the way I did it was slightly different because I learned to fly when initially I had a flying lesson at 18, and then I actually stopped flying at 22 when I heroically got married to the Air Force, and I didn't think I'd fly again. So the way I did it was slightly different than the way a lot of people do it. And I had three young children when I actually ended up going through the rest of my flying training. But it just never occurred to me that it wasn't something I'd be able to do. And I had a lot of support from mostly men who, because there are so many male pilots, sure, most of my champions were men. So really? They also encouraged it. Okay. So it was just a belief that if I wanted to do something and I found out how to do it and I worked hard, I'd be able to do it.
Amazing. But did you find that, were there any sort of doors that you had to really push open? Was there any sort of pushback that you had from it being such a male-dominated industry?
Not really. I was welcomed with open arms, and I think it probably made it actually easier for me, funnily enough, because when I started flying, it was on the University Air Squadron at Leeds, and it was at a time when the Air Force had just decided that women could fly on the front line. So there was a big push to try and get women into the Air Force. And I think that probably helped me to join the squadron, if I'm honest, because I walked up to the desk and said, I'd like to learn to fly, please. And they literally grabbed me with open arms, so much so that when I went home later on and thought, what the hell am I doing? I'm a pacifist. Why am I offering to join even the volunteer reserve section of the Air Force? Sure. And I withdrew my application, and they actually came around to my house and said, please reconsider. We'd really like you to be on the squadron. We'd really think you'd be a great fit. So I think that probably did help me to actually join the squadron. And there was nothing but support there. I never encountered anything other than support and admiration, and encouragement from everybody I met. I've only ever once had somebody say something to me that could have been taken to have been obstructive, but was actually probably said more from a place of care and not really knowing how to say it, which is when I did my type rating. And I'd left the children at home in Scotland, and I didn't know when I was going to see them again. And this instructor said to me, after I'd introduced myself and sort of given him that background, he said, what are you doing here? Why are you doing this? Why aren't you at home with your children? And I was tempted to say, because it's not 1952, but actually he had recently lost his wife. Sure. And I think he had a lifetime of regret because he hadn't been at home as much. And I think he could see a mother going into that situation. And so I never really saw that as being obstructive. I've only ever been encouraged and supported, which is, I know, is not the same as everybody else's story. A lot of women don't get that.
Sure.
But a lot of women do as well, you know.
Yeah, I think it's particularly interesting for me to understand how you found that, as well as some of the listeners that I will have got on the podcast. Because of my background in the transport industry, there's a lot of women. It's again a male-dominated industry, but it can be quite challenging. I think the experience I've had for women in that industry, particularly when they take up more managerial roles with HGV drivers and things like that, where they're going, well, what do you know about this and what do you know about that? Because there's just old stereotypes.
100% that is there. So I know that, you know, people who've stepped into management roles or stepped into even training roles, they've not been treated in the same way as they would have been if they were male. Okay. And that has been difficult for them. I didn't do that. So I might have done if I'd stayed for longer, but I never got to that point. So it never happened for me that way. And I think also, you know, I was already in my 30s when I joined easyJet. So I already had kids and I already had a mortgage. I was already going through the same things as all the captains that I was flying with. So we kind of were equal partners. And I think they just saw this very determined woman who was so determined to achieve the role that I had trained for, that I was willing to live away from my family for days on end. And I moved back in with my parents at 36, which was glorious.
I can imagine.
It was fantastic. They were great, but I felt like a spinster. And, you know, I just didn't have that issue. And even when I failed my command the first time, which is something I expect we'll talk about later, but when that happened, that could have been a door for people to sort of pull me to pieces a bit and say, well, it's not surprising, she's this, she's that, and she's everything else. But I think because of the way I handled myself after that, which was to accept responsibility and not blame anybody else, it kind of gained a bit more respect than it might have done otherwise. So I think it's always about the way you handle yourself as well as the way other people, you know, if you know you're going into a situation where you're likely to experience a bit of pushback, there are ways that you can conduct yourself that would just remove that. Yeah,
absolutely. I know I'll come on to it later. We were going to talk about you failing command, which we will pick up at a later point. I wanted to pick up on what you said about your determination, because I don't think that's in my other questions, and it's certainly something that sort of flowed through as I was preparing for the podcast and asking you backstory questions and those kinds of things. Where does that drive? Where does that determination come from? Because you've really, you know, I talk a lot about the sacrifice it takes to succeed in whatever field it is you want to succeed in. What is it that drives you? What is that determination? Where does that come from?
I think there's a lot that drives me. But I think ultimately it's if I'm going to do something, I want to do it well. I don't want to do things half-heartedly.
Sure.
But also, I don't think that if I'm doing one thing, I can't do something else. So I appreciate the fact I have to manage my time and make sure I'm not trying to do too many things at the same time.
Sure.
But I think it's just this lifelong belief that there's nothing you can't do. If you've got the skill and the, obviously, capability of doing it. I mean, clearly, you know, there are certain things I can't do that men can do because I don't have the same anatomy. Sure. And there are certain things men can't do that women can't do for the same reason. But, yeah, other than that, really, why can't I, you know, learn to play the piano, or why can't I sail boats or fly planes, or, you know, it's always just I feel like I can do those things, so I'm going to try. I'd rather try and fail than not try at all, because for me, that's not living. And there's a story actually from when I was a child that I remember my parents telling me, that we were on holiday in Scotland with my grandparents, and I was always very stubborn and self-dependent then. And apparently I would, if somebody said, would you like some help with that? I would always say, no, I do it. And so I think that's just kind of who I've always been.
Yeah, amazing. And you do, like I say, you strike me as very determined, and I can imagine quite a stubborn child, probably.
Yeah, I think I probably was quite stubborn, but I wasn't nasty. I wasn't nastily so. You know, I wasn't the sort of child that just wouldn't do things. I was quite biddable, as well as being, you know, well, I wasn't allowed to be. You know, my parents were quite strict growing up in loving but strict.
Sure.
So, you know, if my mum and dad said you were going to do something, you were going to do it. There wasn't really, you know, there was quite a lot of kickback against that in my teenage years, which was a lot of fun for everyone.
I can imagine. Is there a rebellious streak in there?
100%.
Okay.
Don't put me near a button that says "Don't push the red button." Don't put.
Well, even in a cockpit where there's all sorts of buttons.
Especially in a cockpit.
Right,
I mean, you learn to control yourself, don't you? But you know, if there's a sign saying "Don't walk on the grass," I'm going to really try hard to walk on the grass without anyone finding out. But you know, maybe sort of sneakily rebellious.
Sure.
I was never really naughtily rebellious. You know, it was always a little bit, I always had boundaries that I was a bit too scared to push on too hard, but they've fallen away a lot as I've got older.
Sure. Okay, cool. It's interesting you said about not stepping on the grass. I'm conscious that you were at a university, at Cambridge University yesterday, where there are definitely signs saying do not step on the grass.
There are, but at Clare College at the moment it's covered in scaffolding and there's lots of boards up around. You really can only walk on the path. So I wasn't even given that opportunity to test the theory.
So you've travelled today from, obviously I know you live in Scotland and you travelled down to work in Cambridge. And I know this wasn't on my question list, but just out of interest, what's the work you're doing with Cambridge Judge Business School?
So they run the executive education program. They run a decision-making course and they bring me in at the end of it they have a dinner. And before the dinner, I give a talk about the model that we use in aviation to make decisions at 38,000 feet, 600 miles an hour, and with 180 people sitting behind you needing you to get it right, which is what my TEDx talk was about recently as well. Yeah. So the model that I have always shared is the one that we use as pilots in the air. Okay. But actually that's not that memorable because unless you are flying every day, it's mnemonics like or acronyms like DODAR and FORDEC, and like nobody can remember that when they leave the room. Sure. So I've turned it into my own acronym, which is AVIATE. Okay. So when you hit turbulence, you aviate through it, and AVIATE stands for the 6 different things that I then talk about. So that's what they bring me in for. Sure. And that's the 3rd time I've worked with them, and they want to keep me on the programme, which is fantastic.
That's amazing. That's really cool.
Lucky to be working with them.
I'm sure I'm going to ask you about Aviate later, just looking at my question. So I will move on to that in a moment. But for now, my next question was around your grandmother, Grace. So when we were prepping, I was asking about your background and growing up and those kinds of things. Because one of the things that I think is really important from a podcast perspective is we get under the skin of Emma. And get under the skin and really sort of understand your background. So your grandmother, Grace, sounds like she was extraordinary, resilient, loving, strong. How has her influence shown up in the way you lead today, especially when you're faced with turbulence?
Well, from a very young age, I learned that it was no point whinging around Grandma because she married her sweetheart in 1941. Wow. I think 1941, 1943, something. During the war, they married and they had 3 children. And in 1952, my granddad, who I never knew, he was called Frank, came home from work and she wrote a two-side piece of A4 explaining that week. And he came home from work one November and she remembered the smell of his coat being cold. It was a cold day and he had a sore throat. And by the following week, he was dead and he died of polio. Okay. So he was taken into hospital and my mum was 2. She had a 6-month-old brother and a 6-year-old brother. And at the time, obviously, not everybody had phones in their houses. Mm-hmm. And Grandma was going to visit him and she was told to go home and get some rest. And they'd call her if anything changed. And they couldn't call her, so they called her dad. He came round to the house to tell her that he needed to take her to the hospital and he died before she got there. So it's a horrific way. They hadn't been married for long enough they'd only had good times in that sort of short period of time. And she lost the love of her life at a time in the 1950s when single parents were kind of, cast out of society almost. Sure. And it was hard for her. And my mum remembers growing up in a house that had a bomb crack in it that let in freezing cold air in the winter and putting newspaper under the sheets to keep them warm and things. And it was really, really hard. And my grandma just got on with it. Sure. She didn't whinge. And I did say to her one day, how did you keep going after you lost Frank? And she said, well, my darling, I had the 3 children that I had to get out of bed for every day. You can't just stay around in bed feeling sorry for yourself if you've got a baby to look after. And I thought, no, you're absolutely right. And of course, it was different times as well, because the communities everybody lived in, they did radical things like actually speaking to each other. And, FaceTime was this.
Sure.
So she was very lucky. She had 4 sisters who rallied round and supported her, which made her very close, particularly to one of them. And that's part of what made our extended family so big and strong. But I think everything I've ever gone through since, I've always measured against that horrific loss that my grandmother experienced and my mother experienced and still feels very keenly. Even all these years on, 73 years later.
Sure.
My mum still feels that she was robbed of her childhood or robbed of her father.
Sure.
And it's hard to kind of grizzle about anything against that backdrop.
Absolutely, yeah.
So I think that was just always there in my life. And it was, I think my upbringing was always very much, actually crying about it isn't going to do anything. Yes, we need to deal with our emotions and things like that. But ultimately, you have to just keep putting one foot in front of the other, keep breathing, keep going, and find a way to live alongside whatever it is you're dealing with.
Amazing. And she sounds truly amazing.
Grace she was. We used to play charades.
Sure.
And my uncle, Uncle Stan, he was given Amazing Grace as a charade to act out, and he sort of acted amazing and then pointed at my grandma. So whenever I hear Amazing Grace, I always think of her, but also of him.
Oh, I love that. That was actually, it's so interesting. I self-taught myself guitar when I was a young lad. And the first song in the book that I was teaching myself from was Amazing Grace.
Oh, brilliant. It's my favourite hymn.
Is it?
Actually, yeah, because of my grandma. Yeah.
Amazing. Okay, so whilst we're on you growing up, I was going to go to a question about command, but let's stick with you growing up for now. So you mentioned around growing up with a faith around and having a Christian childhood. Tell me a bit more about that when you were growing up. What was that like?
Well, it was just what we knew. Mum and Dad went to the United Reformed Church in the town I grew up in. They had all their friends were there. They married and moved to that town, and that's where they met all their friends. And so we were just born into that environment. So it was like growing up with this massive family of, kind of kids that were our age, people that were my parents' age, people that were my grandparents' age, and everybody in between. So it was quite amazing, really, because you had this sort of instant massive family to kind of kick around with and guide you a bit as well. And there was one couple in particular who were kind of in between my age and my parents' age, who I would go and babysit for them, but really it was so I could just go and there's an awful lot of downloading going on there as well. So they were real mentors for me. Sure. Not always spiritually either. It wasn't a case of, I was going around having Bible studies all the time. It was, although, that did happen as well, but it was just built-in friends that you didn't even have to go and look for. So, the kids I grew up with in that church are still friends that I have now that I'm still very close. They've known me all my life.
Sure.
And I think it's something that, whether it's a church environment or anything else, I think that sense of community is dying away a little bit because we all move around so much.
Sure. Yeah, and I think it's really interesting now because I see. So I grew up. I went to a Church of England school at primary, and we've not, I've not really been to church or anything like that more recently. But my son, interestingly, has started wanting to go to church. He's 13, yeah, and he's been going to youth group on a Friday at the local church and things like that. It's quite interesting how that's
so interesting because I'm the same. I don't go to church on a regular basis. My parents do. And I differentiate very much between religion and faith. So for me, I don't have to do something at 10 o'clock on a Sunday morning to have a faith.
Sure. But
it's really interesting that there is this massive resurgence in young people looking for some sort of meaning in their lives and finding it in faith, whether it's Christian faith or Muslim faith or Jewish faith or whatever. But it's like there's this kind of search for meaning going on in younger generations at the moment, which is really interesting. They're doing it in a different way, though.
Yeah, absolutely, and it is fascinating, and it's part of I suppose the friendships and the community that he's making is then guiding that as well. And I think that, there's at the moment there's a lot of I suppose banana skins out there for young people at the minute.
Yeah.
And if that's helping steer away from those banana skins, then that's a positive
100%.
thing as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's tough being a kid, and much harder than it was for us.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, well, I think absolutely online. Talking of which, then, so this leads me on to our. Obviously, I picked you up from the station here in Peterborough, lovely sunny Peterborough, where we're recording, and you spent a bit of time here in your younger years, in your former years.
I did. So I reckon it's 34 years ago. I did a gap year working initially for 6 months for a church, a very posh church in West London called St John's Hyde Park. And then they asked me if I'd like to leave in the January. I was a bit too rebellious for them, I think. And I was then placed at the YMCA in Bretton in Peterborough. And it was a baptism of fire for me because I'd grown up in this very kind of quite quiet, reasonable sized town in Essex. And I'd had a reasonably sheltered life. And I walked into this place where people had been kicked out of home. They didn't come from loving families. I didn't understand what that was. People were... there were people who took drugs, people who had knives, people who couldn't write. So one of the things I did was help people to write the CVs so they could try and get jobs. I was there to help people who lived there to just go about their daily lives. And, it was amazing because people accepted me, even though I was not from their world and they weren't from my world, because I think I just accepted them for who they were as well. But it was I was held up at knife point in a lift one night because somebody thought I'd called the police on them for their drug habit, which I hadn't done. Yeah. And it really frightened me. I don't to this day know how I got out of that lift.
Sure.
But I went to my next door neighbours and said, I'm just a bit shaken up because this has just happened. And they basically went round and destroyed this guy and said, never touch her again. Wow. Which, again, I was like, oh my God, what have I just created? But it was a really amazing time for me. It just opened my eyes to a whole different world than I'd ever seen before. And I think that's really good for somebody particularly somebody who had that sort of privileged upbringing.
Sure. It sounds horrifying being stuck in a lift with someone at knife point. I don't know. I don't quite know how you cope with that.
I probably didn't take it seriously. I probably just went, yeah, whatever.
Really?
I mean, I don't know. I can't remember. It was such a long time ago, but I can still remember how frightened I was. And I suppose I just thought, well, this can't end with me in an ambulance.
Sure.
So I've got to get out of here without him doing something to me that is going to put me there. So I must have just talked my way out of it.
Amazing.
I probably just talked to him so much. He was like, do you know what? If you stop talking, I'll put the knife down.
Yeah, please, let's get out of here now. Yeah. Amazing. Okay, so you've spoken about failing command after you having a life-threatening illness. In that setback, what did you learn that a success couldn't have taught you?
Oh, it's so much about myself because it was the first time I had failed at anything. I passed my driving test first time. I didn't do brilliantly in my exams, but I passed everything first time. So the first time I failed anything was when I was 42 and I failed my command attempt. And it was just it broke me because I think looking back, I knew that I wasn't ready for it because I'd had 6 months off work because I'd had a serious illness and I came back to work desperate to prove myself and making some bad decisions really about, I'm ready to go and do this. Of course I am. Look at me. Mm-hmm. And that was a bad decision, really. So I hadn't really prepared for it in the right way. And if I had passed that at that time, I never would have really learned how to be humble. I think I would have been an arrogant and potentially dangerous captain because I wouldn't have had to try. I wouldn't have known what it felt like to have had to basically go back to work with egg on my face and have to learn that humility and deal with it with grace, which is what I chose to do. But when I first came home, two things happened. First of all, my husband was half awake, and he'd left a bottle of champagne on my side of the bed and said, "Congratulations, Captain." And I was like, "I failed." And the children came in the next morning and said, "Mummy, we're really sorry to hear about your command," and gave me a big cuddle and said, "Can we get a puppy?" I was like, "Wait, what?" And I had said, when I finish my course, we can get a puppy.
Sure.
I didn't specify that I had to pass it.
Right. Okay.
So, listeners, make sure you're very careful with the wording you use to your children, because they will use it against you. But the other thing that happened is that I thought, well, maybe this is it. Maybe I've had my fun flying now. Maybe it's time to stop flying. Maybe this is a sign that I need to stop.
Sure.
So initially I just thought, well, that's it. Game over. Not going to fly again.
Sure.
And then as I became slightly more rational, I thought, well, okay, I'll go back to flying again, but I'm obviously not going to stay with easyJet because it's just so embarrassing that I've let everybody down, And then I realised that actually I wasn't a very enticing prospect for any other airline, having just failed a command course. And the only thing I had left to do, very much like my grandma, was to put one foot in front of the other, keep breathing, go back to work and just get on with it and not blame anyone. And I think that was really important as well. My grandma didn't blame anyone for her husband dying. She just accepted that it had happened.
Sure.
And I had to do the same thing. And yes, I could have found lots of ways in which I could have taken the company to a tribunal and made a big fuss and said, "This is ridiculous, you shouldn't have done this." But ultimately it was me that failed.
Sure.
So it taught me great humility. And I'd already had 6 months before, I'd already been taught by not dying this huge gratitude for everything in my life, the huge gratitude for the second chance at living. So very quick, within a year, I've been taught huge gratitude and huge amounts of humility. And I had to just go back to work and swallow it. And it really changed the way I then saw my career. Sure. Not taking it for granted, perhaps as well, a bit more respect for, being able to say no and saying, I'm too tired, I can't do that. Yeah, because sure. I did and do tend to push myself to the limit all the time.
Yeah. The challenges of being so driven and determined, right?
100%. And you have to learn how to balance that.
Yeah, absolutely. So for, and I'm not an expert at this, but command is the qualification to become a captain. And what does it entail?
Well, it's interesting, isn't it? Because when you are in leadership, if you step up from a non-leadership role into a leadership role, you don't generally go on a course. You just get given a promotion. You're expected to do the same job and find out your own tools to be able to do that with.
Sure.
But when you become a captain, you can't do that because the weight of the responsibility that you carry is really heavy. You are responsible for every single one of those lives that's on board that multi-million-dollar aircraft. So you have to be taught how to do things in a different way. You're still flying the same aircraft. You know how to do that. But you're now sitting on the left-hand side of the aircraft instead of the right. So there's a little bit of motor muscle memory kind of training going on there. But it's mostly how you manage a day, how you problem solve, how you make decisions, how you manage your team, looking at the bigger picture, making sure that you are capable of dealing with an aircraft that has lost its capability and you've got to land it safely. That's essentially what it's for.
Great.
So, it's a 6-week course where you do some time in the simulator, some ground school, and then some line training actually in the air.
Sure.
And prepares you for that sort of transition to responsibility.
And obviously a huge amount of lessons learned through the process of failing. How long did it then take you to summon the courage to go again?
Well, I wanted to go at it again as soon as I could. I thought that having failed this sim, there were people at easyJet that were trying really hard to find a way to make it happen for me. They wanted me to pass.
Sure.
They could see that they could see I wasn't the sort of person that just couldn't be bothered and had messed up.
Sure.
And they could understand that there were reasons for it and everything. So they actually, there was one guy in particular who tried really hard to find ways that he could allow me to do sort of the line training and then go back in and do the simulator flight, the simulator test that I had to pass. But ultimately he said to me, the problem is that if I put you out on the line and we don't do it in the way that we do it for everyone else, and then something happens and we have a hull loss or we lose lives or injure people, that sits on my shoulders.
Sure.
And I said, I absolutely agree with you. I couldn't agree with you more.
Sure.
Thank you for trying, but 100% agree.
Mm-hmm.
And what I learned in the year, they decided it would be a year before I could have another go, which was a really tough pill to swallow.
Mm-hmm.
But again, I had to just suck it up and just run with it.
Mm-hmm.
And, I learned more in that year back in the right-hand seat about how to be a captain than I probably had taken on board over the previous 6 years. So, it just it just taught me so much and was a really, really valuable lesson. And I think, absolutely made me into the captain that I was probably always meant to be and wouldn't have been otherwise.
Sure. And I guess the next question is if you could go back and change it, would you change it?
No, because I wouldn't learn the same lessons and I wouldn't have the same experiences. And actually, maybe that was also what allowed me to go on and form the charity later on. Maybe it was because of the way I treated people, because of that experience. Sure. All the things that have happened since wouldn't have happened necessarily. I do think that when we fail at things, it makes us into the people we're supposed to become. Sure. So we shouldn't look at failure as being a failure. We should look at it as being, a learning point and something we grow through. Sure.
I'm a really big advocate for learning from failure, and I think I'm really pleased that you've raised such an amazing example of that as well, because I think certainly in the cultures within the workplaces I've grown up and worked in, it's always been a challenge to get people to think differently about failure. Yeah. And when things go wrong, and blame and not finger point and those kinds of things. And it's fascinating. The first time I really started thinking about learning from failure was actually, interestingly, and I've never interviewed anyone who's ever worked in aviation, but it was Matthew Syed's Black Box Thinking book,
right,
which is, absolutely fascinating. I saw him do a keynote at the National Highways Conference a couple of years ago, and I've got an absolute man crush on the guy. It's amazing. I love him to bits. But yeah, have you read the book? Have you read that book?
I have read the book, and I know the story behind it as well. And I think it's an incredibly sad story that he's turned into something really powerful. And I think that's a gift, isn't it? That, if you can take something crushing like that and turn it into something that makes life better for other people and safer for other people. Sure. What an incredible legacy.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And I'm just going to check, you didn't read my script, did you? Because you started talking about Project Wingman, which was essentially my next question. So, so Project Wingman, 6,500 volunteers that you've got to support the NHS during the pandemic. What was it? What was it about your leadership that enabled those volunteers to rally and support Project Wingman? And if you tell the listeners a bit about Project Wingman as well, if that's okay.
Well, I think it was a number of things. So in 2019, I was in an ITV documentary called Inside the Cockpit, and that there were 3 episodes, and I appeared prolifically in 2 of them and became known overnight as Captain Emma, which, that was something that I absolutely loved doing. I didn't expect the reaction to it that I got, but it meant that I would be sitting on an aircraft waiting to fly people to somewhere, and I'd hear people getting on saying, "Is it Captain Emma flying us today?" And I'd go out and say hi, and they burst into tears, hopefully for the right reasons. But
I'm sure.
So it was that made me well known in the industry, and certainly in my airline. But also, I'd had time on the University Air Squadron. I'm married to the military. I knew quite a lot of people in different airlines and different parts of aviation as a result of the rich life I've been lucky enough to lead. And so that made me known. Then obviously the pandemic came along, and like everybody else, I was staring into an abyss thinking, what on earth am I going to do now? And I was a peer support mentor for easyJet. And I spoke to the psychologist that oversaw that program, a guy called Rob Bohr. And I said, there's got to be a way that we can do something to support the NHS. And he said, well, I've been talking to someone else about exactly that thing. I'll put you in touch. So he put me in touch with a guy called Dave Fielding, who happens to be the brother of Helen Fielding, who wrote Bridget Jones's Diary. But I didn't know that until sort of a couple of years ago. So I got in touch with this guy, Dave. He was a BA captain. He still is. And he told me what he'd been thinking. I told him what I'd been thinking. And we said, we think we've got something here. Let's call it Project Wingman. We have joked about who was going to be Maverick and who was going to be Goose. And, And literally within 3 weeks, we had our first lounge up and running. So the idea we had was that we would use uniformed aircrew to go into hospitals and provide tea and empathy for NHS staff. That was it. So all we needed from the hospital was a room that was large enough to practice social distancing, because that was what we were told to do at the time. And they agreed to provide us with tea and coffee. But we would be there to serve the tea and coffee and to listen to the things they wanted to talk about. So sometimes it was distraction therapy, because would talk about flying and holidays and places we'd visited. Sometimes it was just listening while people downloaded about the death they were seeing on an unprecedented scale that they hadn't been trained for and were being faced with every day. And sometimes it was just being there. And we thought maybe 30 or 40 people would sign up to help support this, and it would last 2 or 3 weeks, and we'd all be back in the air again. So Dave wrote the manuals so that we made manuals for the hospital so they knew what they could expect, for team leaders, for volunteers, we just wrote manuals for everybody so that if anybody said, what is it you're doing? We could say, read the manual. It wasn't a long manual. It was just, like a speaker one sheet, I suppose. And so he did that, and he had the in with the NHS. I proofread the manuals and added what I needed to. But I had the platform. So I went on my company workplace, I went on Facebook, I went on LinkedIn, I went on all the social media platforms that I was on at the time. And I just said, look, we've had this idea. If you want to help, I made a Gmail account that was called something like aircrew NHS response @gmail.com or something like that. And I said, just email us and let us know. And in 3 days, 750 people had signed up to help. Wow. And I was like, I can't keep up with this, because I was having to take all their details and put them into a spreadsheet, which I'm not very good at things like that. So the first person that came on board as a volunteer was my friend Esther, and we'd been instructors together at High Wycombe years before, and she'd lost her job when Flybe went bust. Right, okay. And she contacted me and said, how can I help? So I said, are you only good with spreadsheets? She said, oh, I love spreadsheets. So she managed that. And that spreadsheet became a database of 6,500 people. Like, it went from 750 people on the Friday to something like 1,200 people in 2 weeks. And we opened our first lounge. And as soon as the first lounge opened, it was like a domino effect. So we were sometimes opening 2 or 3 lounges a day in London. And then Dave looked after London, and he said, well, you can do everything outside of London, because we didn't think it was going to get that big. So it was basically Dave in London and me in the rest of the country. But I didn't go anywhere. I couldn't go anywhere because obviously, we weren't allowed to. So everything was run from my desk outside my toilet on my landing in my house in Scotland, and everybody else did all the work and I got all the glory. So that's how it went.
Yeah, of course. And I think you're very humble saying that you didn't do any of the work and got all the glory, but I think you obviously did an awful lot.
I mean, I was working 18-hour days at the beginning.
I can imagine.
I checked out of life. My family said to me, why are you even bothering to be here? Because we never see you. I joined them for meals, but I was doing stuff all the time. I was eating. I didn't do any cooking or washing or taking part in hilarity or sitting in the hot tub with them or anything. I just, all I did was Project Wingman. And after a couple of weeks, I said to Dave, I need a break, because I can't do this 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And he said, well, COVID doesn't take a rest for the weekend, and neither should we. And I said, no, I'm switching off for the weekend. And actually, that's what happens when you're setting something up. You just have to put the graft in. But I had to then balance it as well. And it was hard work, but not visible, because I wasn't able to go in. I went into my local lounge a couple of times to set that up, but most of the time I was the puppet master and everybody else was independent puppets.
Hi, my name's Pete, and I want to thank you for tuning into today's podcast. I'm a coach, speaker and author, and if you want to take your personal development that bit further, did you know that I offer a mastermind program as well as one-to-one coaching? If you're interested, please do reach out on peterushmer.com.
Well, that's also part of being a leader, isn't it? Which is sort of very much taking the burden in the background. Sounds like an absolutely fantastic initiative. Is it something that's now stopped? How long did it run for?
So we closed the charity earlier this year. And for me, part of great leadership is knowing when to stop something.
Sure.
And we set up for a very specific reason at a very specific time to serve a very specific purpose.
Sure.
And the three things we needed were a need and people and money.
Mm-hmm.
And the need for well-being within the NHS is always going to be there. It's never going to go away. But that's not something that volunteer aircrew in uniform can be the long-term solution for. So as people went back to work, of course, we then needed to find other ways to provide the same service. And we had these 2 double-decker buses that were going around the country providing the same service, which meant hospitals didn't have to give up as much space, but it also meant that we didn't need as many volunteers. So that really helped, but actually they cost money to run. And initially there was money from the Captain Tom Foundation, which was specifically for wellbeing projects.
Okay.
And there was money from NHS Charities Together that was specifically for wellbeing projects. So there was money to pay for things. And we were a not-for-profit. So we were only charging what it cost us to supply the service. But it still cost money. And when there's a budget to balance, there isn't money for things like that. Wellbeing is not seen as being important enough to throw money at it.
Of course.
So as the clapping for the NHS stopped and as people started to realise that, things were going a bit wrong in the NHS and maybe they couldn't get appointments or whatever, and publicity for what we were doing sort of dropped off. So the money dropped off. So the desire to do something about it didn't really fall away. I mean, I think given an unlimited budget, every manager in the NHS would want to look after their staff. But
Sure.
it is the thing that falls away the first. And that's exactly what happens. So rather than let it fizzle out, we made a conscious decision to close the charity this year. And we had a closing party at the Royal Air Force Club in London, and then went round the corner to a pub for a drink. And that was the first time I met Dave face to face, the guy who'd founded, because he left after a couple of months.
Sure.
And I had never met him face to face. And that was really important to me that he was there at the end as he was there at the beginning.
Sure.
So it was an incredible thing. And I think an incredible response by people who are facing their worst nightmare, who chose to get out of bed every day and do something they didn't have to do for people they didn't know. For me, that's magic.
Yeah, absolutely. It sort of sends shivers down my spine, to be fair. And there was a question which my question seems wholly vanity based, because I'd love to have an MBE and that was sort of what was coming next. And it seems a bit of a shame to sort of move on to something that is so vanity based, certainly for me, because I'd love to have an MBE. But how was that? So that's led to you getting an MBE, right?
Yeah, and that was just something that was completely unexpected, because obviously when we set the charity up, it was literally a way of opening a parachute in what felt like free fall.
Sure.
For me, as well as everybody else, it wasn't just to help other people. I needed something to provide me with a safe space to fall.
Sure.
And when I got an email in the middle of a meeting one day, and it was from Downing Street, and I thought, oh my God, I'm in really big trouble now. I just assumed I must have done something really naughty. I was like, what? And I got this email, and it said, you have been nominated to receive an MBE. And I thought, wow, that's incredible. And I had to keep a deadpan face in this meeting and pretend that nothing had happened, because, of course, I wouldn't be so unprofessional to be looking at emails in the middle of a Zoom call. And in the email, it said, you can't tell anyone. And I was like, you're literally telling somebody who talks for a living that I can't tell anyone. So I did tell my husband, and I did also I was allowed to tell my press officer, which we had at the charity. And I just texted her and said, I'm really sorry, but you're going to be quite busy between Christmas and New Year. And she said, I know, I put you forward. She was one of the people. So the big group of people, you're not supposed to know who's nominated you, but a big group of people who got together and put me forward for it, which was amazing. And it was great because it gave the charity so much publicity, because when I was contacted by the BBC and all the news agencies, and they said, would you come on TV and talk about it? I was like, yes, I will, because I thought this is how we get Project Wingman's name out there.
Sure.
And so that was really incredible. But, I didn't tell anyone else. And the night it was going to be made live on the news, we told the children and my parents. And I was about to phone my brother-in-law when the 10 o'clock news broke, and it said, airline captain lands MBE was the headline news on that
amazing.
night. And he called me first and said, were you going to tell us? And I said, yeah, I was literally about to pick up the phone.
Bless you.
And it was amazing because of what it did for the charity. It was incredible, but it actually served another purpose as well, which was to give me a lot of publicity, which I hadn't really expected, I suppose, quite naively. But as much as I was able to use that for the charity, when I set my speaking business up, I was already a known person. And I think it has helped.
Sure.
The fact that if you put my name into a search engine, you can find out about the story of me getting an MBE. But I maintain that MBE was awarded to me, but it belongs to every single one of those 6,500 people that did that during the pandemic, because it was without them, it wouldn't have happened.
Sure.
But I do also understand that without me, they wouldn't have had a reason to make it happen. So I understand that, but I do, whenever I meet people who volunteered for Project Wingman, I always thank them for the effort they went to, because I think it was astonishing.
Absolutely. So I'm just in awe. I'm in awe, really, of what you've achieved there. The next question wasn't one that I'd prepped, but has come to me because it's something that I know that a few of the clients who are leaders that I work with grapple with, and that is that acceptance of the success, which I can see based on the way you just responded there. There's been a grappling for you there, because there was such a huge effort by so many people who won't necessarily have got an MBE, and you received that. So whilst you deserve it, there's an element of, I don't know, challenge, I suppose, around the way you think about that. Is that the case? Is that the right word? I don't really know what the question is I'm asking, but how have you reconciled that, I suppose, in your head, that obviously it's such an amazing thing for you to have achieved, but that you're so grateful, I suppose, to all of the other people who have helped support to make it happen?
Yeah, 100%. And I think going back to my childhood, it comes from growing up in a family where I think I was considered to be a bit too big for my boots sometimes, because I was clearly a fierce and determined person. And we were never allowed to wallow in any kind of, or we were never allowed to boast about things, to the point where actually if it ever looked like we were likely to boast about something, we would be brought down several pegs by our parents. And that's quite a gift, really. But there are times when I think actually you could have built us up a little bit sometimes, and we certainly have with our children. But I think that it didn't sit comfortably. I mean, anybody who has known me all my life will say, but Emma loves to be the centre of attention.
Sure.
I actually don't.
Yeah.
I'm loud, but I'm actually very shy. My worst nightmare is to walk into a smallish room full of people I don't know and have to make conversation, because I just never think I've got anything interesting to say.
Sure.
I'm very happy standing on a stage talking to 5,000 people.
Sure.
Because I don't have to make small talk with them.
Sure.
So I think it really comes from, yes, I do. Of course, I love to be in the limelight sometimes, but I also kind of love to be in the limelight because I'm larking around and making people laugh. When somebody says thank you to me in that sort of way, I kind of tend to push it away a bit and sort of say, well, I didn't do anything. I actually had this conversation with my TEDx coach last night. By text, and I said to him, I just don't get it. I don't get what people think is inspiring about me. And he said, but that's part of your magic. It keeps you humble.
Sure.
And so that's something I'm quite comfortable with. I do accept that I was the one that put my neck on the line and said, right, let's do this. And so that's why that recognition has gone to me. But I even more see it as being something that couldn't have happened unless other people had said, well, we think she's worth following, so we'll do it. Yeah,
absolutely. It's really interesting hearing you speak about that. So inspiration's interesting, isn't it? Inspiration's really interesting, and what we take inspiration from. And it's really interesting because you are so inspirational, genuinely inspirational, and then not recognizing that. And then it is really, I find it fascinating because I think my upbringing was very similar. So I was taught not to boast. And certainly even now, I'm fortunate enough to still have both my parents. They were born in the 50s. So they're both sort of, 70 this year. And they're very good at keeping me grounded. and which is an interesting choice of words with
Isn't
speaking
it?
to you, right? But it's interesting how I can almost see certainly in them that when things happen that, you know, I won an entrepreneurship award, and I could almost see like there's pride but toes curling as well because of the limelight. And then I kind of feel that because of the way I've grown up, I suppose, is that on the one hand it's really amazing, but on the other hand, somewhere deep inside me, my toes are curling up going, oh my God, this looks like I'm full of myself. And I was always taught that that's the wrong thing to be. It's a real conundrum.
Well, it is, but I think you have to just learn to sit alongside that. And I think what's been lovely has been, you know, I was always I always felt a little bit as if, you know, my dad is a big joker, and this is not telling tales out of school. This is a conversation I've had with him. And when I passed my commercial flight test in New Zealand, I called him up and said, Dad, I've just become a commercial pilot. And he said, great, darling. Does that mean you can serve nuts up and down the aisle now? Because he didn't really know what to say. He's the same generation as your parents. He didn't really know what to say. Yeah. And yet, when I worked for easyJet, he would go around the Lloyd's market, because he's a Lloyd's broker. He'd go around the Lloyd's market saying, my daughter's a captain for it, or my daughter flies planes for easyJet, my daughter does that. And he was, and I think is still so proud of what I did and what I've achieved. So he wasn't really meaning to say that to knock me down, but it did knock my confidence. I was like, how can you say that? I've literally just phoned you up and told you something that's amazing. Yeah. And hardly anyone does, let alone hardly any women. Yeah. And you just said, does that mean you get to serve nuts up and down the aisle? And I had a conversation with him about it. I said, did you realise that when you said that, it really made me feel sad, because you were kind of scratching my shiny, and you were the person I wanted to tell most in the world. Sure. Makes me feel quite emotional even talking about it now. And he hadn't really realised that. He was just like, oh, I didn't really know what else to say, darling. Of course I'm very proud of you. And I said, yeah, but you say of course, but how do I know you're proud of me if you always make a joke out of it, and if you always it's almost like you want to bring it down a notch. Sure. And he typical kind of 70-something man. I won't call him a boomer because that would be wrong. He's totally a boomer. But, but he's sort of very much, I'm not listening to this, woke rubbish from you. But what he really means is, I don't really know how to say, I might have got that wrong, and I am really proud of you. Sure. But he shows it in so many other ways. You know, it's not a big deal now, but if I hadn't have confronted it, it could have become a big deal. Yeah, sure. It's tricky, isn't it? Because I suppose one of their sayings they instilled in me, and no doubt will have been instilled in you as well, is the actions speak louder than words anyway, right? 100%. Yeah.
I suppose that's just a generational way, isn't it? Is that sometimes the words are a struggle, but it's in the actions.
I'm okay with the words not being there if he keeps paying for my car to be fixed, to be honest with you. That's a great action. Thanks, Dad.
Fair enough. Okay, cool. I realise that I need these back on to be able to read my next question.
Welcome to my world.
I'm just getting used to them. I didn't realise how blind I was.
They're great.
Thank you. You said, so when we were prepping, you said leaders must learn to stay human in an era of AI and automation. Okay, so obviously you're a leader in a very technical role as well, but how can leaders do this? How can they be more human even while embracing tech?
I think that's the question, is how. We all know what we need to do, but how do you do that? And for me, it's about this. It's about having conversations with people where you learn stuff about each other. And, often leaders will sit in offices and say, oh, my door's always open. Great. Do I want to come into your office? Have I got time to come into your office? Why do I have to come to you? Why can't you come to me? Sure. And it's that kind of, that Toyota kind of mentality of going to the Gemba, which is the workplace, returning to the Gemba. And actually go and speak to the people that work with you. And remember that when you're sending an email to someone, telling them something that they might find difficult to swallow, just remember that on the other side of that email is a person who you don't actually know what's going on in their life. Even if you do speak to your people, you don't always know what's going on. They might have had a massive row with their partner. They might, if I take my own current life, nobody knows until now, because I'm about to tell you that my brother's got pancreatic cancer. He's already in a wheelchair. He lives in Australia. That's a massive thing. Sure. I've got stuff going on with my children. I've got, I'm at a stage of my life that is difficult because I'm a 52-year-old menopausal woman, and every woman on the planet will understand that, and every man that lives with a woman will understand that even more. But, I have challenges in my life that mean that sometimes when I get an email from you saying, why haven't you done this, or this isn't going to happen, the way it's written actually affects me more than you might think it should, or you might think it's going to. So actually just remember that on the other side of that piece of communication is a person who has got stuff going on,
Sure.
big bags of shit that we carry around with us all the time.
Sure.
And just remembering to be kind. And, you and I are in a group where there's one rule, and that is be kind.
Sure.
And for me, that's the most important thing we can be. But I think, being human is about also, being human doesn't mean don't ever use AI, because AI is a fantastic tool that we need to get our heads around, and it's already in our lives every day. If you go onto Google, you are already using AI, even if you don't think you are. So we need to learn to harness it. And I'm actually about to embark on a really exciting project with somebody to combine AI with the sort of human side of leadership, which I think is going to be a really great sort of combination to help leaders to understand, how you do the two. But I think it's just about exposing yourself a bit as well. And I don't mean in the way that's going to get you arrested, obviously. But, just be open with people. You've got nothing to hide. When you're leading, it's okay to say, I don't know.
Yeah.
But I'm going to do everything I can to find out. Or can you help me find out?
Sure.
It's okay to ask for help as a leader. And it's okay to get to know your staff on a personal level. You don't have to go down the pub and become godparents to their children as a result of that, although you might. But you do kind of need to know who it is you're working with. And even in a big company, you can do that because you've got team leaders who you can say, right, you know your teams. What do I need to know about your team dynamics at the moment? What makes their hearts beat every day? And I think that's the really important bit is, just remembering why we're here, what we're here for. And something my dad said to me, actually, when I had this illness years ago, he said, never let the thing you're doing become more important than the reason you're doing it in the first place. And I didn't understand him at the time, but it became crystal clear when I nearly died and when I failed my command and when I left my job as well. The big moments in life are the moments when you kind of realize that actually the people that surround you are more important than anything else you do. So look after them.
Sure.
And there's, I can't remember the name of the guy, but there's, is he Adam somebody who said, the people you work with, their children know your name. So make sure they know it for the right reasons. Adam Pacifico.
Okay.
That's one of his quotes.
Okay,
He said,
I love that. Yeah.
the people you work with, their children know your name. So make sure they know it for the right reasons, or the reason they know it is down to you.
Got you.
And I think if you think about that, that helps you to remember that the people you're working with are all people. We're not machines. We're not supposed to be. And we don't run, even if we were machines, we don't run our cars or our aircraft to the red line on the RPM gauge. So we shouldn't be running our people to that either.
No. You got me thinking there. I've not thought about it like that. So thank you. Yeah, very interesting. You said you're always curious. How's that helped shape you?
I think being constantly curious means you just never stop learning. And if you never stop learning, you never stop growing. So it means that there's never a day when I haven't learned something new, but there's also never a day when I don't want to learn something new. It means I think it means I'm open to other people explaining things to me. So I do have very strong opinions, but I'm completely happy to change them if somebody paints a different picture for me and fills in information I don't have.
Sure.
I won't accept something. I'm not just going to accept something because somebody says it.
Sure.
I'm always going to want to fact check and background check. And I think fact checking is part of how we move forward with AI, by the way.
Sure.
Because it's worth remembering that AI can't ever tell you it doesn't know something. So it'll always just make something up.
That's also true, yeah.
So, I would say it's like a man, but that would be such a horrible thing to say.
Accepted, though. Accepted.
So, you know.
On behalf of the guys.
Sorry, guys, I didn't mean it. You're all awesome. But, you know, I think that always wanting to know more. The day I wake up and I don't have any interest in what's going on around me anymore is the day I know I need to shuffle off to Switzerland. I think for me, that's, you know, that and laughter are the two things that I need to have to keep my heart beating.
Amazing. You mentioned aviate earlier, so now's the time that we're going to, I think this, hopefully, well, maybe I'm assuming, but what's one lesson from flying aircraft, perhaps a decision-making model or a mindset that translates into leading people on the ground?
Well, there are so many lessons from aviation that translate into life and the business world. We could cover a whole podcast on it, but the lesson that I've drawn from aviation that I can really teach leaders to use is the aviate model that I've developed from aviation's toughest lessons. And it's the model. The original model was called an OODA loop, and it was designed by an American general because he realized that actually fast jet pilots needed to have a process they could follow to make decisions very quickly in the air. Sure. So he created the OODA loop, which is observe, orientate, decide, and act. And it just goes round and round in a circle. So you're constantly looking where you are, working at, seeing where you are, working out what that means, making a decision, acting on it, and keep going round and round. And in the airlines, that's been expanded slightly because we're still flying at 600 miles an hour, but we're now 7 miles above the planet instead of 200 feet above the planet.
Sure.
And so there's a little bit more time. So there are various models that have been developed, and they're called things like DODA and four-deck and Ciosis. And they don't mean anything to anybody in business because unless you're using them every day, they don't mean anything actually to people in airplanes either. They're just, they're just a mnemonic to help us to remember how to do something.
Okay.
But when you're going in a simulator, you would say, well, we're going to run a DODA now, so that the examiner knows that you're using the decision-making model. And so what I've done is taken those models and I've turned them into something that's memorable, because if a pilot comes to talk to you and gives you a model to use, you're much more likely to remember aviate than you are to remember, something else.
Sure.
So aviate starts with aviate in small letters, which is that you fly the plane, navigate to a place of safety, communicate. And what that means in business is that whatever the big thing is that's just happened, you have to keep the business running. Do whatever it takes to keep your plane in the air. Mm-hmm. So, it might be an operating theatre with the Matthew Syed sort of analogy.
Sure.
It might be a trading floor. It might be a logistical operation, moving stuff around the country. It could be anything. Mm-hmm. Do what it takes to just keep the plane in the air for now while you sort the problem out. Navigate to a place of safety. So, steer the business in the direction it needs to go so that the problem can't get any worse. Mm-hmm. And then communicate with the people that need to know. So you don't need to tell everybody. You don't need to send a text to your mum saying, just to let you know, a wing's just fallen off. You need to tell the right people.
Sure.
And talk to the right people to get the right information.
Sure.
And that leads into validate. And you look at V is for validate. What is the problem we're dealing with? Is it what I think it is? Because you might find in an aircraft, for example, you get a warning saying that something's happening, but actually it's not that that's caused the problem. It's something else that has also caused this alert. And it's exactly the same in business. You might have a power outage and you think that the transformer in your building has gone, but actually it's just a fuse in your office, or it might be a fire at the substation, whatever. So you've got to try and validate the actual problem to work out whether or not it's a big problem that can be contained, or a small problem that can go away, or a massive problem that's going to take weeks to sort out.
Sure.
Then investigate to find out more. So I is for investigate. Ask the right people the right questions. And they need to be open-ended questions as well. Mm-hmm. And the example I often give is bringing an aircraft out of Corfu, where I've just been on holiday, but actually flying it. And we took a bird. Well, we hit a bird on takeoff, and it made a massive bang and a loud judder. And we sort of went, oh God, And if I'd have said to the cabin crew, did we just take a bird down our right engine? They would have gone, yeah, absolutely. Mm-hmm. Not because they're silly, but because I'm the tallest person in the room because I'm the captain.
Sure.
So they're just going to agree with everything I say. So if I just say to them instead, did you notice anything?
Yeah.
They're going to say, yeah, of course I noticed something. They might make you look silly, but they'll say, of course I noticed something, Div. You know, we got a loud bang and a loud judder, and I saw flames coming out the right engine. And now you've got useful information because they've just told you something you haven't put in front of them. So now you know the bird's gone down the right engine. So you need to ask the right people, and that might be people on your shop floor, or it might be people further up your management chain. You know, what have you just noticed that's happened here? And then you need to assess the situation. So that's about option generation, weighing up the risks and benefits, choosing a course of action. You need to talk to the right people and make sure that because you've chosen the right action, but that might be the least worst decision. There might not be a perfect solution to the problem. You've got to make a decision. When you've made the decision, you've got to talk to the right people, make sure that that decision is acted on. And then the E is the execution, the acting on the decision that you've made. But you've got to make a decision. And I find leaders don't make decisions. They don't want to make decisions because they're worried about accountability and making the wrong decision, fear of failure. But actually not making a decision is a decision in itself to do nothing. And that can be dangerous.
Yeah.
Not just cost, but it's also costly. It costs you money if you don't make decisions. And it's a really simple process that you can use in business, but you can use it when your car goes wrong at the garage as well. You know, what's the problem I'm dealing with? Ask questions to find out more about it. You know, talk to the mechanic rather than the lady on the front desk who might not know.
Sure.
What are your options? You know, are you going to fix it? Are you going to get rid of the car? Are you going to, you know, what are you going to do about it? And then you obviously talk to the right people to make that happen.
Yeah.
And then you carry out the actions from that. So I think putting it into that analogy, I think often helps
Love that.
to see how you can use that. Not just, you know, yes, it's great in a plane. It's also great in business, but you can use it in everyday life as well.
Sure.
Because I've used it day after day after day, I find myself doing it automatically now. And it goes in a loop still. So when you've carried out the actions, if new evidence comes to life, just like a lawyer would, you can go back into the process again and say, now I've got new
circular
information. It's a different decision.
Love that. That's really good. I love that. I'm gonna remember that one.
Good.
Aviate.
I'm glad you like
Love
it because I've literally just launched it to the world 2 weeks ago, my TEDx, which hasn't been published yet.
I love that. Yeah.
So the first live audience I gave that to last night outside the TEDx was at Judge Business School in Cambridge, and they loved it as well. So
awesome. And how long till your TEDx is live?
I think it's going to be another week or so. So it goes through this process, as you know, where it has to be edited and then it's sent off to TED. They approve it and then it comes back to the producers and then it goes live onto YouTube. So in the next week or so, hopefully.
Exciting.
Yeah.
Excellent. It's
not as exciting as this podcast, though.
Well, of course not. Of course not. Awesome. So when life inevitably knocks you down, you said you choose to swim rather than sink. You also are open about learning from others, how important is vulnerability. So, you know, one of the things that I picked out, I suppose, from when we were prepping was around this ability to stay vulnerable. And how's that important when it comes to resilience and leadership?
I think that it's easy for me to stay vulnerable because I don't know everything.
Sure.
So I know that I feel like I can sort problems out. You know, my children always describe Daddy as the person you go to for sympathy and Mummy as the person you go to who's going to get you out of prison.
Okay.
Because I just get, you know, I like to solve problems, which makes it very difficult for me to be. I'm not a good person to look after you for 2 years while you go through some terrible thing. I'm not your person for that.
Sure.
I'd love to be, but I'm not. So I'll help you sort the initial problem out. But if you keep coming to me every week for 2 years and the same thing keeps happening, I don't have sympathy on that level.
Yeah.
My husband is much, much better at that. And that's why the children love him more. That's on the record now, children.
Right, okay.
But yeah, no, but you know, we do different things. And I think understanding where your skill set lies is a really important way of staying vulnerable, because it's okay for me to say, I don't know what to do with this. And I don't know how to conduct myself in this situation. So you need to go and see that person, or I need to have some time to process this and work out, how I'm going to manage it. Normally what happens is that I don't deal with the emotional side of things until much later. I push that down the park and I just go, right, okay, let's solve this problem. Don't worry, I've got you. We're going to resolve this. And then, especially when it's a big emotional thing, I'll just separate myself from that, park it, deal with the problem and move on until I get to a point where I go, right, I actually need to deal with this now, because I am very aware of the fact that I need to do that. And it's okay, I think, to be vulnerable in front of your team, which is not the same thing as saying it is okay to cry every day in front of your team.
Of course.
It's okay. It was okay for me to say to my entire team at Wingman, I have decided to take voluntary redundancy from the job that I have loved and fought hard for over the years. And it was okay for them to know how upsetting that was for me and what a really difficult decision it was.
Sure.
But I was running a business and a charity. So actually, if I'd have spent the whole meeting saying, oh, yeah, and it's really difficult and I don't know how I'm going to manage it, that's not the job I was there to do.
No.
So I think it's okay to, it helps people to connect with you if you say, sometimes I find things difficult. You see me on stage as, I've got an MBE, I'm an airline captain. I come across as being a successful speaker and all the rest of it. But actually, you need to know that I failed my first attempt at command. You need to know that I also struggle with things in life from time to time.
Sure.
And you need to know that I frequently spill food down me, and I frequently have cars that break down, and I frequently have fights with my children or my husband because we don't see eye to eye on things. I'm a human being first and foremost. And that's the vulnerability that I think is really important. And that's the humanity that helps us to live alongside tech and AI as well.
Sure.
So I think it's just really important to say, I don't know. I don't know the answer to that, but I will either find it out or I will come back to you with an answer in this time frame.
Yeah.
And when you can't do something, I think it's okay to ask for help. And in fact, I think as leaders, we should be putting people around us who can do the things that we can't, and then empowering to do the jobs that they've either volunteered to do or you've asked them to do, and just let them get on with it.
Sure.
I think leadership is ultimately, successful leadership is laziness. Because if you just sit there and say, right, you're really good at design and websites, you can do that. You can do press, you can do making books, you can do whatever. You just sit back and this machine works around you and you're kind of overseeing it all, but you're not actually having to do all the work. You shouldn't be doing all the work as a leader. You should be empowering your team to do that. And saying, I don't know how to do this is so empowering for other people because it does make you vulnerable. It's okay to expose yourself as not being able to do everything.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. I think that's really important. I think that gets lost, doesn't it, on some people? I think some people have lost that. I can think of a few people in my past that potentially that's lost on for sure. We've got on to quick fire questions.
Great.
I've got a couple of quick fires for you. So 5 quick fire questions that I ask all my guests. The first is, how do you develop yourself?
Constantly learning every day, even when you didn't think you had anything left to learn.
Okay. Fantastic. And do you read? Do you know, is there a podcast you listen to? Is there
I'm
anything?
not a big listener of podcasts, actually. I do like them, but I don't really have time to listen to them unless I'm traveling. So I read a lot.
Yeah, okay.
I love books. I've always loved books. I have a Kindle, a really old one that I still carry around with. It's really battered.
Yeah.
But there's nothing better than a book. I watch stuff as well. I'm a very visual learner. So...
Okay.
it's much more powerful for me. I'm much more likely to remember something I've watched in a TV program or something, or on a TikTok. I completely understand the TikTok generation who learns in 3 seconds. I'm like, wow, that blows my mind.
Got you.
But yeah, watching and reading.
Love that. Okay. Second question, advice for your younger self.
Don't just get out of your own way. Yeah. Don't take yourself so seriously. You get to your 50s and it's this big release, because you just don't care what people think of you anymore.
Sure.
And I've spent most of my life caring too much about what other people think. And you've just got to go and do it. And, favourite quote, Taylor Swift, if people don't like you for being you, be more you.
Love that.
Yay to Tay-Tay.
Yeah, I love that. My eldest daughter's a massive Taylor Swift fan. She'll love that. She'll definitely love that. 3 tips for success.
Love fiercely, listen carefully, rush carefully.
Right. Okay. Rush carefully.
Mm.
Okay, so it's about pace. It's about pace, but doing it in a careful manner.
Yeah, less
Love
haste,
that.
more speed.
Love that. That was certainly one. That's one of my dad's favourites. That is. Excellent. What sacrifices have you made?
Lots, really. I was an earth mother before the children were unceremoniously dumped in boarding school, so I could selfishly go off and pursue my career as a pilot. And whilst I joke about it a bit, saying goodbye to my 9-year-old and sending her to sleep in a house that I wasn't in still makes me feel sad. It was a huge sacrifice that if we hadn't have done that, I couldn't have had the career I had, which has showed the children that you can go and do things that people don't expect you to do. And I've spent my life really doing things that people haven't expected me to.
Mm-hmm.
And I've had this conversation with them, and I've said to them, do you think it was selfish for me to go off and fly, which meant you had to go to boarding school? Because we had one parent that was deploying to war zones and one parent that was flying at 3:00 in the morning to Malaga. Not always to Malaga, but And they said no, they didn't think it was selfish, because they said you've shown not just us, but particularly our female friends, what's possible.
Sure.
That you can break the mold.
Amazing.
Thankfully. That could have gone one or two ways, couldn't it?
I was going to say, I'm pleased that they've taken that route.
Well, they were on holiday with us last week, and they're all in their 20s.
Okay.
And it's a huge privilege for me to have been able to go on holiday with all 3 of my children and my husband and their partners as well. And we had such a fabulous time. And that's when you know that whether or not you made the right decisions at the time, you've managed to make it work.
Yeah, got you.
Yeah.
The end is good. Final question of the quickfire questions: discipline or motivation? Which is more important and why?
Carrot is always more important than stick.
Okay.
I think you need to be disciplined as a person.
Sure.
But it's always more important to motivate people into doing things than it is to rule with fear.
Amazing. Love that. Okay, cool. One final question. I've saved one question for the end. If listeners were to take away one thing from listening to Captain Emma Henderson MBE, what do you most want that message to be?
I want it to be, make sure that in everything that you do, you don't forget that as a species, we were designed to be social. So it doesn't matter what you do and how you do it. Just be kind to the people that you are around you. Offer help to, carry an old lady's shopping bags across the road. I mean, ask them first, otherwise they'll think they're robbing them. But, make sure that you don't lose sight of the things that make us human.
Sure. And
spread that love to everybody else. Spread that everywhere you go, because the way we change the world is to change the small corner of it that we inhabit, and everything we do there spreads out like a ripple and affects the rest of the world.
Amazing. Thank you very much for joining me on the podcast.
Thank you for having me. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Yeah, I've really, really enjoyed it. And there's some amazing insights. So, really appreciate you joining me. And I hope that the listeners have enjoyed it as much as I have making it. And
I hope so too.
Yeah, I really do. And, absolutely fantastic. If I'm honest, my toes are cringing a little bit because I likened your MBE to like winning a stupid entrepreneurship award. So I'm thinking about editing that bit out.
No.
Because that was...
No, it's absolutely the right thing to do, because I completely get it. I 100% was going, this is so nuts. But it's the same thing. So no, you should keep that in, because the entrepreneurship award is brilliant and amazing, and it's the same sentiment. So
yeah, as it came out, I was like, in my head, I was going, I can't believe you're using this as a similarity, and thinking this is totally cringe. What are you thinking, Pete? No, it's not at all.
And if your listeners want to know more about my story, of course, they can buy my book, Grounded.
Absolutely,
on Amazon.
Absolutely, yeah. So just a little bit to camera. The camera's there. If you've enjoyed listening to Do I still say Captain? Captain Emma Henderson
Tell me what
MBE.
you like,
Love it.
I'll
Captain
answer.
Emma. If you really enjoyed listening to Captain Emma, make sure you follow her on LinkedIn. Make sure that you subscribe to this podcast and listen again, because it's been amazing. I reckon this is probably worth 2 or 3 listens. There's loads of insights there. Check out Project Wingman and the work that you did there. Inside the Cockpit, shout out to that documentary. I reckon that's worth going and watching. And then obviously Amazon, Emma Henderson's book, and she's available for keynote speaking across the globe. The further, the better.
Well, I'm in Hong Kong and Kuala Lumpur in November.
There we go.
Very
Check that out.
exciting.
Hong Kong and Kuala Lumpur. So if you're looking for a keynote speaker, Emma's absolutely killing it out on the stage, doing an amazing work. So thank you very much for joining me.
Thanks so much for
It's
having
been
me.
an
I've
absolute
really
pleasure.
enjoyed speaking to you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Pete.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for joining us on today's It's Not So Lonely at the Top podcast. We really hope you've enjoyed today's podcast. I'm absolutely delighted that you took the time to listen, and I really hope that you'll subscribe to ensure that you receive future episodes too. If you want to find out any more, please do search It's Not So Lonely at the Top podcast, and you'll find it on your favourite podcast app. Thank you.